Hi guys, my name is Alex, and today we'll delve into the case of a young mother who went out to celebrate New Year's and disappeared. Police uncovered some eerie clues, but couldn't get to the truth. It wasn't until 35 years later that there was a long-awaited breakthrough, and everyone finally learned what happened to her on that fateful New Year's Day. Tanya McKinley was born on January 25, 1961, in the small American town of Milton, Florida. Growing up in a loving family, she shared a close bond with her older sister. They enjoyed playing outside together, skateboarding, and bowling. After finishing high school, Tanya decided to move to Pensacola, about 25 miles away from her hometown. She wanted to explore the medical field and focused on one of the quickest professions to enter: a medical transcriptionist. No medical degree was required to become one. All Tanya needed was to attend special courses. Her cousin, Vanita, chose to relocate with her, and the two women shared an apartment to save on rent. Soon after moving, Tanya met a guy named Tim, and they began dating. Eventually, they moved in together, and in 1983, their son, Timothy, was born. While Tanya was thrilled to become a mother, her relationship with Tim wasn't perfect. They argued quite often, and about a year after their child's birth, they decided to part ways. At the end of '84, Tanya temporarily moved in with her cousin, who by that time had a husband and two children. Tanya planned to find a place of her own and move out as soon as she gets the opportunity. On December 31st, Tanya, along with Vanita and her husband, decided to celebrate New Year's Eve at a local bar. They left their kids at a late-night daycare and set off to ring in the new year. They had a lively evening, filled with laughter and dancing. Tanya also saw a lot of familiar faces at the bar. When midnight struck, they welcomed the new year of 1985, and Vanita, with her husband, prepared to head home. The daycare, where they had left their children, was closing at 1 a.m., giving them just 1 hour to pick them up. But Tanya wanted to stay at the bar a little longer. Given that her sole focus had been on work and caring for her son for the past 2 years, this was her only opportunity to unwind and relax, so she didn't want to miss it. Tanya asked her sister to pick up her son from the daycare, and Vanita agreed. Since they lived together and Vanita had to collect her own kids, it wasn't a problem. Before parting ways, Vanita asked Tanya how she planned to get home since they had arrived at the bar in their car. But Tanya assured her that she would easily find someone to give her a ride, considering the fact that there were many familiar faces at the bar. On the morning of January 1st, Vanita woke up and, to her surprise, realized that Tanya had not returned yet. It seemed odd since she should have been back long ago. Vanita thought that Tanya might have gone to stay with one of her friends, so she wasn't overly concerned initially. But everything changed soon after. Vanita's worried mother-in-law knocked on their door, delivering the shocking news. Tanya had been found dead. That night, around 3 a.m., a Pensacola resident and her daughter headed to a vet clinic due to some urgent health issues with their dog. However, as the woman left home, her daughter noticed something strange on the roadside. She thought it was a mannequin and mentioned it to her mother. The woman decided to take a closer look and was horrified to realize it was a human body. She immediately returned home and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and found the body of a young woman lying in an empty lot near the road. Her tights were pulled down, the dress was lifted, and her shoes were missing. Next to the victim, they discovered a blue towel with red stains resembling blood. Police identified the deceased as 23-year-old Tanya McKinley. A few streets away, they discovered her shoes, along with a purse containing an ID in her name. The body was handed over to medical experts, while investigators continued to examine the crime scene. It was quickly established that the victim was likely killed elsewhere. There was no blood near her body except for the towel stains, and there were traces on the ground indicating that the body had been dragged from the road towards the roadside. On the towel and the victim's body, police found their first potential leads. There were several human hairs, as well as pubic hairs and dog fur. They assumed that the first two samples belonged to the killer, possibly someone with a dog. Medical experts determined that Tanya suffered a blow to the head with a heavy object, but the cause of death was strangulation. They also confirmed that the victim had been sexually assaulted. The experts collected a semen sample from her body, but in those years, DNA analysis had not yet become widely used in forensics. All they could establish was that the suspect had type B blood. Considering that these clues didn't lead detectives to the killer, they began compiling a list of potential suspects. Their focus initially shifted to Tim, the victim's ex-boyfriend. Speaking with Tanya's relatives and friends, the police learned about the issues in their relationship and constant arguments both before and after the birth of their son. It turned out that when Tanya decided to end the relationship, Tim was against it. He didn't want to part ways with Tanya and continued trying to persuade her. Tim consistently called Tanya, visited her, and behaved as if he couldn't accept the breakup. Investigators considered that on New Year's Eve, Tim might have followed Tanya to the bar, leading to a confrontation that ended in murder. They brought the man in for questioning, but he denied any involvement. Tim also agreed to provide hair samples. Although experts couldn't extract DNA from them, they were able to compare the hairs under a microscope, which would have been sufficient enough to establish similarity. However, Tim's hair significantly differed from those found on the victim's body and the towel. Based on this fact, he was temporarily ruled out as a suspect. After that, detectives turned their attention to everyone who was present at the bar on New Year's Eve. They questioned Vanita about any individuals who might have behaved strangely or aggressively towards Tanya, but she insisted that the evening had passed without any incidents and proceeded very well. The police also discovered that after breaking up with her boyfriend, Tanya briefly dated a man named Kurt. He happened to be the bartender at the same bar where she celebrated the New Year, and it was his shift that night. They spoke with Kurt, but he claimed no involvement in the murder. According to him, after finishing his shift, he went to a New Year's party with friends. Investigators interviewed his friends, leading to an intriguing discovery. They confirmed Kurt's presence at the party, but said that he didn't arrive immediately after ending his shift at the bar. Gathering all the testimonies, police concluded that theoretically, Kurt had enough time to commit the crime. Through multiple interviews with individuals from the bar, detectives determined that Tanya was last seen alive at 1:15 a.m. However, no one witnessed her leaving the bar. The police also interviewed residents in the area where the body was found. One family recalled driving by that spot around 2 a.m. and stated they were certain there was no body. Investigators established that Tanya was killed within a little over an hour and a half from the last time she was seen alive, and Kurt didn't have a solid alibi during this specific time frame. He agreed to a polygraph test, and the results were inconclusive, showing deceptive answers to some questions. But the lab experts determined that Kurt's blood type did not match the blood type of the killer, as identified from the semen sample, so the man was eliminated from the list of suspects. Police continued their search for other potential suspects, but their efforts led to dead ends. The analysis of the killer's semen wasn't possible, and they lacked any substantial evidence or witnesses, quickly hitting a dead end in this case. The only thing investigators were nearly certain of was that the perpetrator must have lived in the area where the body was found. This location was secluded from main roads, situated at the edge of an extensive residential area. Police doubted that an unfamiliar perpetrator would go there with the victim's body in a car without any knowledge of the area. Since then, the case remained unsolved for many years. Timothy, who was only 18 months old when his mother died, was raised by his father and Tanya's family. They all decided to shield the child from the truth about what happened to his mother. As he grew older, relatives told him that Tanya had died in a car accident. This continued until he turned 14. With Christmas approaching, the boy grew curious about the gift his father had prepared for him. Timothy decided to search through his father's closet, only to stumble upon something far more chilling than a mere present. He found a letter written by his father, addressed to the popular TV host, Montel Williams. In the letter, the man asked him to mention the unsolved murder of Tanya, hoping that the publicity would help move the case forward. Timothy read detailed accounts of the murder in the letter, and that's how he learned the true fate of his mother. In the early 2000s, the local police department reopened Tanya's case, hoping that advancements in DNA analysis would help identify the killer, so they sent all available evidence to the laboratory. Upon examination, experts concluded that the blood on the blue towel found near the body did not belong to Tanya, but to an unknown man. They obtained his DNA profile and uploaded it to the FBI database, but there are no matches. The case went cold again until it was reopened in 2015, exactly 30 years after the murder. The killer's DNA still had not appeared in the FBI database, prompting detectives to try a different approach. Modern tools allowed them to search not only for exact matches, but also for partial ones. They considered the possibility that the database might contain relatives of the killer, which could lead them to the suspect. They began to search and eventually narrowed their focus to a specific individual from the FBI database. His DNA shared some patterns with the sample from Tanya's killer, but the resemblance was relatively weak. Police delved into his family background, even reaching out to his relatives. They agreed to assist and even provided their DNA samples for comparison. After examining the samples, experts reached a disheartening conclusion. They found that this family had no connection to the suspect, leaving the detectives, once again, with no substantial leads. In 2018, journalist Tony Adam took an interest in this case. Despite not specializing in crime, his personal interest in this subject drew him to the unsolved murder of Tanya. He wanted to help and reached out to the investigators handling the case. Detectives approached his willingness to help with a degree of skepticism. While an experienced journalist, Tony had no background in criminal investigations. However, given the lack of progress in the case, police figured he couldn't make things worse. The journalist joined the investigation and established connections with Tanya's family. They could see his genuine interest in resolving the case and the significant effort he was putting into it. For instance, he worked to garner media coverage for the case, bringing additional attention to it. He also brought a fresh perspective to an investigation that had lingered for over 3 decades. A year later, in 2019, detectives decided to make another attempt to find the killer's relatives. This time, they sought assistance from Parabon, a company specializing in genetic genealogy. In their previous attempt, investigators had only looked for potential relatives through the FBI database, which contained samples from various criminals. However, Parabon examined public genetic databases significantly broader in scope. Anyone could upload their DNA sample to these databases for purposes such as finding relatives or exploring their ancestry. Experts diligently worked through potential relatives of the killer, methodically examining their family trees to identify someone fitting the criteria of their suspect. They sought a man who, in 1985, was old enough to commit the crime and lived in the area. This process took almost a year, presenting an incredibly challenging task for the experts. However, in February 2020, they finally identified a man who theoretically could be the killer. It was 57-year-old Daniel Wells, who lived in the same city at the time of the murder. Detectives delved into his background and found that Wells had come to the attention of the police several times. In the late 80s, he was arrested for assault and later for indecent exposure. As of 2020, Daniel continued to live in Pensacola, working as a carpenter with a wife and children. But detectives needed a sample of his DNA for a direct comparison with the killer's profile to establish his potential connection to this murder. Due to the absence of any solid evidence, police proceeded cautiously with Daniel, fearing he might flee once he realized he had been identified. They put him under surveillance, and soon the police got an opportunity to obtain his DNA. Daniel threw a cigarette butt out of his car window near his workplace. Investigators seized it and immediately sent it to the lab. Experts extracted DNA from the saliva on the filter and compared it with the killer's DNA from Tanya's case. The result showed a perfect match. 35 years later, the police finally identified the perpetrator, and on the same day, he was arrested. Despite having the results of his DNA analysis, investigators wanted to obtain a confession from Daniel. So they chose to proceed cautiously and refrain from revealing all their evidence at once. They asked patrol officers to pull over the suspect's car under the pretext of a standard ID check. Detectives then approached Daniel and told him that he needed to go to the station with them. They deliberately withheld any additional information, keeping him in suspense. During questioning, investigators slowly directed the conversation towards Tanya's murder, asking about Daniel's whereabouts that night. Initially, he denied ever knowing the woman, and that's when detectives revealed that his DNA was found at the crime scene. Daniel continued to deny everything, but grew increasingly nervous with each question. Detectives emphasized the undebatable nature of the DNA results, leaving him no chance of avoiding consequences. They made it clear that the only way to ease his situation was to confess. And it worked. At some point, Daniel began to speak. Initially, he tried to justify the presence of his DNA by suggesting that he might have had sex with Tanya on that night. But detectives didn't believe this version and continued to demand the truth. And eventually, Daniel confessed to killing Tanya on that New Year's Eve. However, his story raised some serious questions. He admitted to being at the bar where he met Tanya, who mentioned she was looking for a ride home, so Daniel offered to help. According to his story, they went to his house, where they drank and engaged in consensual intimate intercourse. But then, an argument erupted between the two, and Daniel claimed he can't remember the cause of it. The situation escalated to the point where Daniel, in a fit of rage, grabbed a heavy wooden cutting board and struck Tanya on the head. Realizing she had died, he panicked. Daniel took her body to the location where it would later be discovered and left it there. On his way back, he disposed of her belongings and returned home. When asked about the dog hairs found on the victim's clothes and towel, he explained that his roommate had a black Labrador and those hairs were indeed black. Daniel's story sounded like an attempt to minimize his own responsibility. It was hard to believe that Tanya willingly engaged in consensual sex with him, only to have such a severe argument minutes later that led to her death. He also claimed that she died after the blow to the head. However, medical experts had undeniable evidence that the cause of death was strangulation. A more plausible scenario would be that Daniel attempted to assault Tanya and she resisted. He then struck her on the head but quickly realized she was still alive, leading him to strangle her. Despite the fact that the suspect's confession probably didn't align with the actual events, the detectives had everything they needed. Daniel was arrested on charges of murder and placed in custody. Right after that, investigators contacted Tanya's relatives, including her son, to deliver the long-awaited news. Timothy couldn't hold back his tears and thanked the police for finally finding his mother's killer. However, Daniel wasn't destined to face a judge and serve time for his actions. Just 2 weeks after his arrest, his lifeless body was discovered in his cell. The examination indicated that he had taken his own life. Tanya's relatives were disappointed by the fact that the murderer had escaped the prospect of spending decades behind bars. Nevertheless, in the end, they found some closure in knowing that, after 35 long years, the case was finally solved. Alright guys, share your thoughts on this story in the comment section, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching.